Living in Virginia, you're in the fast lane on the information superhighway. We've invested $3 billion in Virginia's broadband network to give you one of the fastest internet connection speeds in the world, so you can build relationships, bring new business to our state, and meet the future of education. It's amazing what we can do together. Visit VCTA.com to learn how broadband connects the Commonwealth.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast, connecting Virginians to their government. We're pleased to have Delegate Don Adams with us this morning. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you so much.
Well, I believe this is about day 4 into the new short 46-day session. How are things going for you?
Things are going great. It's really exciting. I'm grateful to be back. We have a lot going on this year. Certainly, I know that many of us as legislators are excited to put forth bills that are important to our community. And I think it's very important that we have the conversation around the budget and, conforming, not conforming. What do we do with the windfall? Making sure that we explain what's happening with this situation, how it affects our constituents, and making good decisions for what to do with that money.
Great. Well, let's talk about that in a little bit more detail, especially in terms of what happened in Congress last year to create that windfall. Now, there was a Tax Reform Act in Congress that lowered taxes for a lot of people, including corporations. But how does that affect Virginia citizens?
Sure.
And why is there a need to conform our tax code to the federal tax code?
Right. Well, so this is really important. I think I would not necessarily say that what happened at the federal level is tax reform, so much as just simply a Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which is exactly that. And what that did essentially was it did in fact change the code so that at the federal level, we saw a doubling of the standard deduction. We saw the removal of many of the deductions that people used to take through itemization. We saw that the corporations who really have made out from this get essentially a 20% flat tax. And what this means for us is that historically Virginia has been a conformity state, meaning whatever you do at the federal level, for example, if you itemize or you take the standard deduction, you must do the same at the state level. Now, whether we should conform or not is really part of the question. To use an analogy of what this federal money means, I think, so one of the narratives that's been crafted is if we use the windfall as the governor has proposed, then we're essentially getting a huge state government tax hike. Now, the reason that's inaccurate is because the federal monies that was used to fund this tax cut is deficit funded. So, for example, if your spouse came home and said, honey, I got $10,000 for you. You can do whatever you want with it, and you're very excited because you guys have been strapped. And then you find out 2 months later that he used your joint high-interest credit card to get a cash advance to give you that money. Now you're less happy, right? This is very much, what we're talking about. The federal government has basically said, we're going to give you this cash back, but it's $1.5 trillion in deficit funding that will play out over the course of this loan.
So the tax cut was not paid for, in other words.
Correct. So now at the state level, it's been done, right? So just like if you had this money at home, you would try to figure out, okay, now I know that this came out of our joint Amex or whatever high interest card we have. And so now what do I do with it? Well, I can make it work for me. I need to make sure I can pay it back. These kind of things. Because this all ends 2025, the end of 2025. So we know it's time limited.
So those are the individual.
Exactly.
Okay.
So I'm just trying to focus on this individual because that's what means the most to most people.
But the corporate tax cuts were made permanent, as I recall.
Yes. So,
okay.
But in terms of what we do at the state level, what we're trying to sort out right now is, so we have money And if we assume that many people will no longer itemize because so many cuts have been made and the standard deduction at the federal level was doubled, that's quite a bit of money that many people will not reach that threshold of $12,000 as an individual filer. So they're going to take that, and then they're going to be confronted with, well, I used to itemize at the state, but now I can't. And so by doing that, even if you combined it, the state and the federal, if you combine that on net, so combine, if you look at what the Commonwealth Institute has said, you'll come out even or a little ahead. But most of that money that used to go in people's pockets is now going to go to the state, creating the windfall. So that's why it's important to figure out, well, what do we do with this money? Because if you look at it just separately, many people will either be even, maybe slightly better, or have to pay taxes. So you have to look at them separately.
Sure.
So this windfall will be of some kind of varying size, and what the governor has proposed is to take all the windfall and do this list of one-time funding efforts, for lack of a better term, that he outlined in his proposal last week. On the Republican end, though, they've proposed things such as increasing the standard deduction. Some even want to double the standard deduction. But doubling the standard deduction would be a terrible idea because we could not sustain that, and we would not be able to fund that and also fund the programs that we currently have existing. But on the other hand, this money is time limited, and the lower economic spectrum and the middle class both have been feeling the pinch of stagnant wages, increased cost of living expenses, increased real estate property taxes. I mean, we're all feeling that pinch. So then the question becomes, do we let people choose and we separate and not conform? Or do we conform and then figure out what to do with that money? Now, I put in two bills, one where we don't conform and we split between the middle class and the lower economic spectrum, the windfall. And that would be roughly $224 million, and it would fund 30% return of earned income tax credit and put about $500 more in the standard deduction.
Now, in terms of the earned income tax credit, right now in Virginia, that's a non-refundable item, correct?
That's correct.
So go ahead.
It would refund about 30%.
Okay.
And that's one idea, and it's just kind of a thinking out of the box idea. The issue with that is that if we don't conform, we have no way to audit that people are doing the right thing, because we've always used the federal auditing system. And so that does create an administrative burden. So then the other option is to conform. So the second bill I put in is that we conform, and we put in thirds a return on the for how we use the windfall, a return on the earned income tax credit, which works out to be approximately 60% return, and increase in the standard deduction, which would be sustainable, so it would be around $750 on the single filer, and then putting the remainder of it, which I think is around $178 million, into the rainy day account, which if just in day-to-day terms you could say is like your savings account. So. Because ultimately, when this stops, if we increase the standard deduction, nobody's going to want to cut that. So then how do we fund that over time when this all changes? So these are the kind of things that I think it's important that we explain to our constituents. And that even though it's oversimplified in the way that I'm mentioning this, it's important conceptually to understand that what we decide to do is not as simple as just getting some money back because that's what happened with the feds. What we decide to do, because we're a balanced budget state, it has to be sustainable, and it has to be something that we can reasonably implement.
Now, your bills, have they been assigned to a committee of jurisdiction yet?
So they have not yet, and I imagine that will happen this week. And I don't imagine as a junior legislator that will get a lot of traction. I think it's important, however, that that people see that just because we're new legislators does not mean that we're not able to think this through and offer some ideas that could be helpful. More important to me, I think, is getting the information a little more clearly presented so that it doesn't seem, Many people, when they look at billions and billions of dollars, their eyes kind of glaze over because it's overwhelming. What's important to me is to find a path that makes it more comfortable to digest and discuss, and I hope that I've been able to do that.
Have you had an opportunity to get any co-sponsors yet?
I have not even done that yet, but I have started to talk about it. Now, there's a bill that is very similar, offered by Delegate Vivian Watts, where she is also sort of looking at a controlled way of handling the windfall through conformity. And as I understand it, there are 20 plus bills related to this that have been put in with different ideas. So I think the larger issue is to get us to have conversations about it, so that there are only very few individuals that actually get to be in the room where it happens, as Hamilton would say, and we want to at least, I think many of us want to at least have provided ideas that could go into that room, so as the men and women who actually make those decisions go about discussing it, they've had a variety of opinions and options, very much like a think tank might be.
In the room when it happens, that's a real interesting comment and quote, because you and I were talking earlier about who actually impacts what goes on in the General Assembly. Now, you have 100 members on the House side,
Right.
you have 40 members on the Senate side.
Right.
Ultimately, there is a committee that resolves the differences between
Right.
the budgets that come out of the House and the Senate. How
Sure.
many members usually comprise that committee?
It could be 10 or 13 members. It's relative handful when you talk about 140 people, and then, of course, then the governor has his own, people assigned or are working with the conferees, so that their negotiations become something that everyone could hopefully live with, and ultimately is good for the Commonwealth. And I think that's really, what makes the newspaper exciting is to have a headline, and typically that is some kind of contrasting battle. That's what really sells papers and media. But what's best for the Commonwealth is the more mundane, coming together of what we think is ultimately going to work well and sustainable and fundable and keeps us at a balanced budget, is pragmatic, and at the same time, aspirational, in that we want to put resources into areas that we believe in. We want to, make sure that our kids grow up with strong educations, and that we have transportation infrastructure, and that we have broadband for access to, information across the Commonwealth. And I think that, I say it's aspirational in a sense, because we might have to look at more creative ways to get from here to there, and some of that may take more time than we'd prefer.
Now, you were there when the governor gave his remarks in
Yes,
terms
I was.
of the budget. What are some of the things that he highlighted beyond this fundamental discussion of tax conformance that lit you up, so to speak?
Well, I do think broadband is a fundamental issue that we have to make a priority. I also believe that we do need to look at how we are compensating our teachers. I don't know that we have really thought about the best way to do that, and I think perhaps the most out-of-the-box ideas might be something that we should consider, because teachers, and I'm a nurse practitioner, teachers and nurses used to sort of have almost parallel income alignment. And now, that's not the case at all. And unfortunately, healthcare is for profit in ways that I think can be unhelpful in general. But as far as nursing has been able to leverage that for-profit status to get compensation that is more in line with the work that they do, whereas teachers, are very much in a position of being public servants, and in a public servant structure that I don't think has been able to they have nothing to leverage. Here in Virginia, we are a right-to-work state. We don't have unions that have any real teeth, as far as teachers. And I think that, and this is a really sort of totally different idea, but I think we do have an infrastructure that we could utilize to look at teacher salaries and get away from things like the funding formula and do something more in line with what the military does. I grew up in the military. I think it's a super pragmatic and infrastructure that has worked well for hundreds of years. I think, if you come in as a lieutenant, you know that all lieutenants are going to be paid X. If we assigned a value for what it is that teachers offer our students as a entry level, then everybody across the board would come in as X. And as you gave length of service and merits to what you do, you would get a graduated increase. Similarly, in the military, when we moved here from Mobile, Alabama to the D.C. area, my dad got a cost of living increase. So we could offer a cost of living, associated with that. And then, when an officer goes off to war, they get combat pay or whatever. And, we might look at some similar type of reimburse, like additional structure for payment when you're in an area that's particularly challenging, however you would define that. And I think that, having some sort of infrastructure that is separate from, where you happen to live and what the value of your real estate is, would be really a more common sense way to do, to really compensate people that are in some ways it's in some ways the most important role in our society. Parenting probably first, being a teacher and molding the minds of our youth to be the adults that we hope that our children will become. That's an incredibly undervalued and important role. So I agree with the governor that we need to increase teacher salaries. My concern with doing this through something like the windfall money is that we still have in code where we have to have a one-to-one match, and so localities that could not afford that one-to-one match, their teachers would not benefit from that type of our current funding streams for that salary increase. And so it's concerning because we need teachers in the western part of the state or in Petersburg, places in the inner city of Richmond. We need teachers to want to be there. And so if you're in a locality where you may not be able to afford that one-to-one match and the teachers can't benefit from that raise, then is it the best thing for us to do? So I would like to see us, come up with some alternatives so that teachers aren't at the behest of the real estate market.
Yeah, and building on your comments about the importance of teachers, their jobs have become more and more difficult over the years.
Absolutely.
And the pyramid is inverted. You talk about how at that level of fundamentals, it's really important to have good teachers.
Absolutely.
They aren't paid as much as, for example, someone who teaches in an institution of higher learning.
Right.
So it's very important to compensate them.
And that's because, institutions of higher learning have become profit centers. And that's really a big problem. And I think that teachers are having to deal with more challenges than ever. And, I put in some budget amendments for the city of Richmond to help fund some support personnel like nurses. And, we know that we need to have counselors in schools. And so people that sort of offer wraparound supports for teachers is also very important for us to fund. Our society has become one that is much more complicated than probably when you and I grew up. We are in some ways more disconnected than ever through our social media, and screen time has really taken on place of heart-to-heart, one-on-one conversations. And I think that our kids have not been able to have the benefit of learning how to communicate and cope with day-to-day problems like they might have when we were kids. Their autonomy is less. My mom and dad used to say, like, do your chores and then get out of the house and come back when it's dark. Kids can't do that today. And so, now kids are really, they're at a loss for how to cope with, challenges or sticky situations that we might have gotten into when we were a kid. And when they make a mistake, everything is posted, and so there's not a lot of room for error. And so now we have to support kids' emotions, through that that sort of lens of a microscopic lens on their behavior. It's a very tough time. And so parents have the hardest job in the world. Teachers have the hardest job, right behind that, and they have to work together. We all have to work together. It is no mistake that there is a saying that it takes a village, and it really does. And we really, if we don't start putting our resources where we say our priorities are, I think that we'll be really disappointed in our future.
Yeah, and the kids who make mistakes today, unlike the mistakes I made, tend to get criminalized as well. That's another problem that I know the General Assembly is looking at.
Yeah, it's a huge problem, and we are looking at it, and criminal justice reform, but also just simple, decriminalizing misbehavior in the classroom. What is disorderly conduct? And it can't just be having the normal attitude that maybe an adolescent with, raging hormones and, things on their mind would have. I mean, we have to stop making it a crime to emote, in ways that are less than acceptable, whatever that definition might be. It really, when we talk about, when there should be real discipline is when people are being harmed, when there is, disrespectful behavior is not criminal behavior. That is something that we need to really shape into something better. But we can't have kids going to, being severely punished for being disrespectful, or, that's just a normal part of growing up, is to sort of transition through what is appropriate behavior and what isn't. And we can't continue to make this as big of a problem as I think we're making it.
And of course, the other phenomena that our kids, teachers, and administrators are confronted with these days is the raft of violence in terms of guns in our schools these days. That's another topic of discussion.
Yeah, and it's a topic that's, without meaning to be a pun, it's loaded. It really is. And I did a pretty extensive, with my team, analysis of gun violence from the Columbine shooting through Parkland. And it was really the Parkland shooting and our lack of response as assembly members that made me do that. What I found, and what I try to do, is not interject any opinion, but really just do a straight up analysis of what are the things that are playing into this. And some of the common themes were that most shooters were white male, average age was 17. Most did not have any kind of psychiatric diagnosis in their background. More than 50% of these events happened as a direct result of being rebuffed somehow, or sort of a emotional reaction. A huge spike in these incidents happened just after the Christmas break, upon return from the holidays. And why these pieces are important is because, again, it gets back to teaching kids coping skills, making sure that kids are heard and seen, and what is the stress of the holiday time? Why is that happening? Should we have the age be 14 that guns are allowed to be unsecured as the threshold for when we actually say to parents or relatives, this is a problem. Maybe it needs to be 17. These are just things that we should be looking at, and it was disappointing that we had to do partisan committees around gun safety and school safety, and calling them two different things as it related to schools. It shouldn't be that we can't have this conversation with our kids in mind, rather than just whether you're pro or against guns, but really what is the right thing for children. I know that last session I brought to the attention of the General Assembly, both on the floor and also in email, letters that I received from teachers who are, a teacher is 23 years old and is really planning out her life such that she's at peace with her own death. Mm-hmm. and 13-year-old kids who can't live without their best friend. And why is this in the mind of our children? But then is putting more guns in school, can that ever be the answer? Or should we be really looking at something completely different? And so it would be nice to have had a more comprehensive discussion.
Especially on those root causes that you discovered.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know that you have in the past worked as a nurse on a lot of different issues, and I think in graduate school you worked on a concept that would allow nurses to have more authority to provide health care to patients. Talk to us about why that's important.
Well, as a nurse practitioner in particular, my graduate work had to do with access to care, and one of the things that was very clear is that it is difficult for nurse practitioners to be able to provide cares in areas that are underserved, typically without independent, the ability to be more autonomous and independent. And that's because, if there aren't physicians in the area and you're tied to that, then you have nobody that, if you want to be there as a nurse practitioner and you're practicing and you're willing to do that, and yet there's nobody that you can, have a co-agreement with, then that's not really helpful that you want to do that. Many nurse practitioners, what I found in my research was their primary motivation was to provide care. Money wasn't even in the top 8 or 9, incentives. So that is really important. I think that nurse practitioners are well trained and well qualified to provide care to the general populace around just basic preventative type care, chronic illness care, long-term diagnoses. This is what we do, and we come from a framework not from the medical model, but from the nursing model, looking at how the person is within their environment and their families and their social structure, and really looking at how to manage and care for their comorbid conditions in that environment, not necessarily looking at as just illness-based and what is the diagnosis and treatment and cure, but really more like how do we prevent illness and what lifestyle changes can we make in addition to prescriptive authority to ensure that we can manage these chronic conditions that many people have. It's very important to have more providers because we know that we'll have less physicians and less nurses in the next 5 years, and so we're not going to have less patients, and there's got to be a method to do this. And we're well educated and well qualified to provide that kind of primary care and chronic care, and I think that's what most nurse practitioners do. And so we were really pleased to see the General Assembly behind that and the governor to support legislation that would allow nurse practitioners who have been nurse practitioners for 5 years or more really get an attestation that says, yes, we can practice independently. So I think that will help the Commonwealth. We'll see what the data shows in another 5 years.
Great. Well, Delegate Don Adams, thank you for being with us. I know you wanted to talk about a constitutional amendment to extend the term of office of the governor. Maybe we can get into that at some other time.
Great.
But thank you for being here.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans. Mm-hmm.